Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the evolving human rights crisis in Nicaragua. I extend a special welcome to our witnesses who have traveled here from Nicaragua and to the Nicaraguans in the audience. I know this is a difficult and complex moment in your country's history. I want to assure you that we in the United States Congress are paying attention. We are concerned and we are committed to doing what we can to make sure that U.S. policy contributes in the most constructive way to resolving the internal political conflict that has escalated since April. I've been around long enough to remember the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Contra War that followed the overthrow of the Somoza regime in the 1980s. I agreed with those who opposed the Reagan administration's aid to the Contras, and in fact, Congress acted to cut off aid in 1985. In part in response to reports that the Contras were routinely killing civilians, Sandinista officials in the interior of the country, heads of cooperatives, nurses, doctors, and judges. At the time, some U.S. government supporters of the Contras justified the violence. One of them was Dwayne Dewey, the Central Intelligence Agency officer in charge of the covert war. After all, he told the House Intelligence Committee, this is a war, a paramilitary operation. But enough members of Congress were sufficiently appalled by the tactics to pass the Third Bolden Amendment and outlaw the assistance. For those of us who opposed the Contra War more than 30 years ago, the Nicaragua of today is not what we were rooting for. As you will hear from our witnesses, over 300 Nicaraguans have been killed and some 2,000 injured since social protests erupted in April of this year. The deaths include 24 children and adolescents, and 21 police officers. The majority of deaths have been attributed to the government's police forces and to armed pro-government groups. What began as a protest against a government proposal to, quote, reform the Social Security system has grown into a major opposition movement that demands that Daniel Ortega step down. The same Daniel Ortega who was a leader of the Sandinista revolution 4 decades ago and has been elected president 3 times since 2006. The man who once stood up against Somoza's oppression has become the oppressor, and this is a tragedy. After the first burst of violence, the Ortega government responded well to international concern. It cooperated with a May visit by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and agreed to follow-up mechanisms. In June, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights sent a mission at the invitation of the government. But as we will hear, cooperation slowed once these agencies began to attribute responsibility for grave human rights abuses to the government. In late August, the government expelled the UN High Commissioner's team. Now the government is simply denying that abuses documented by the UN, the Inter-American system, and highly credible local human rights organizations have occurred. Meanwhile, as the opposition has evolved, so have the government's tactics. We have heard reports of attacks on churches, the dismissal of health workers who treated the wounded, arbitrary detention and torture, including sexual violence against men, the targeting of families, and the use of a new anti-terrorism law to persecute and criminalize dissent. Unlike many Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans I have met over the years, Nicaraguans are not used to being afraid of their government, but today they are. The tactics deployed by the Ortega government are similar to those used around the world by authoritarian leaders whose hold on power is threatened by dissent. The consequences tend to include increased migration and refugee flows as people flee. And in fact, thousands of Nicaraguans have fled into Costa Rica since the crisis began in April. So we have convened this hearing today with 2 objectives. First, to get the well-documented evidence of human rights abuses on the record, and second, to hear recommendations as to how the U.S. government and Congress can be most helpful to those in Nicaragua seeking a peaceful resolution to the crisis. As you will hear from our second panel this morning, the opposition movement remains firmly committed to nonviolence. Those recommendations should not focus only on Daniel Ortega. It may be tempting to think that everything would be fine if Ortega were just to step down. But as former UN Human Rights Commissioner Zaid al-Hussein observed in June, the repression and violence we've seen in recent months are the product of years of erosion of rights and weakening of institutions. The problem in Nicaragua is bigger than one man. And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panel of witnesses. First, Maria Claudia Pulido, Has been the Assistant Executive Secretary for Monitoring, Promotion, and Technical Cooperation at the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights since September 1st, 2017. She's from Colombia and has worked for the Commission since 2001. And Guillermo Fernandez Maldonado has been the Deputy Representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia since 2014. And between July and August of 2018, he was the Senior Human Rights Officer and Coordinator of the mission team deployed by the UN Human Rights Regional Office for Central America to Nicaragua. Both these individuals have incredible resumes, but I'd be here all day reading them. And so I want to welcome you both to the hearing. Ms. Polito, we will begin with you.
Good morning. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights wishes to thank Congressman James McGovern and Congressman Randy Holtinger for the chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for the invitation to be here today. The Commission also welcomed the presence of Guillermo Fernandez, Senior Human Rights Officer of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has been conducting a special follow-up to the situation of human rights in Nicaragua since April 2018 in the face of the serious acts of violence that have been taking place in the country. From May 17 to 21, the Commission undertook a working visit of the Nicaragua in which it traveled to different parts of the country, interviewed dozens of people, and received hundreds of testimonies from victims, relatives of victims, particularly mothers, and witnesses of serious human rights violations. The Inter-American Commission prepared the report, Gross Human Rights Violation in the Context of Social Protests in Nicaragua, which was presented to the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States on June 21, with 15 recommendations to the state of Nicaragua. Following up of these recommendations, on June 24, the Special Monitoring Mechanism Nicaragua, MECENI, was installed in Managua, and on July 3rd, the Interdisciplinary Group of Independent Experts for the Investigation of Acts of Violence and that took place from the 18th of April to May 30th was also installed. In May 30th, was signed an agreement for the creation of this group between the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the General Secretary of the OAS, and the State of Nicaragua. To date, the Inter-American Commission, as you mentioned, has documented 325 people killed in the context of the human rights crisis, in which 24 children and adolescents were killed and 21 police officers. Also, there have been allegedly been more than 300 people arrested. 300 health professionals have been also dismissed for carrying some of the more than 2,000 people wounded, and 40 professionals from university has been also dismissed. According to the information received on the site by the teams of the Inter-American Commission, 3 phases with different patterns of human rights violation have been identified. The first phase begins with the strong repression of the peaceful protests initiated in the country and the consequent violation of human rights that began in April 18. This includes the violation of the right to life and personal integrity due to arbitrary use of force by police agents and parapolice agents, using lethal and non-lethal weapons, selective execution of people, and violation of freedom of expression, including attacks against journalists and the media. Also, irregularities and denial of medical attention and the obstruction of humanitarian work to assist persons injured in the context of the acts of violence and repression. Arbitrary detentions with excessive use of force, ill treatment, including torture, incommunicado detention, and lack of judicial control and violation of access to justice. As of July, the Inter-American Commission identified a second phase of violation that begins with the so-called clean-up operations of the government and the demobilization of the barricades and roadblocks by parapolice and police groups. The situation becomes more aggravated. Repression and selective and arbitrary detentions and raids are reported in search of the names of people who participate in the protests and in the barricades. Likewise, Degrading treatment is observed against the families of the detainees, and their visits were obstructed. Repression is extended to the relatives and neighbors of the person identified by the active participation of the councils of citizen power. Hatred and attacks are inflicted against the Catholic Church. The number of people fleeing their homes in search of safe houses and asylum increases. According to the information received, as of July 2018, at least 23,000 people had allegedly requested asylum in Costa Rica. The third phase, characterized by retaliation, highlights a selective persecution of protesters, particularly human rights defenders, students, social leaders, and government opponents, which includes threats, stigmatization, and criminalization through hundreds of judicial processes brought under unfunded and disproportionate charges, such as terrorism and organized crime. During this phase, there were also incidents of violence against police officers and supporters of the government party that, due to their nature, were also condemned by the Inter-American Commission. Today, the Commission notes with concern that this strategy of criminalization and stigmatization continues to create an adverse context for the social protest. The situation has been creating a climate of terror and despair among the population. Human rights defenders, women, and children find themselves at great risk. While in the beginning, dialogue with the government and the exchange of information was fluid, since the beginning of July, the Inter-American Commission had requests from the state without any success, information in order to be able to collect data about the victims, access to detention centers to observe the situation of persons deprived of liberty, and access to files that the group of independent experts can provide technical assistance in the criminal investigations. Nevertheless, based on the requests and testimony received, as of September 17, the Commission has issued 23 precautionary measures to directly protect 114 people who are at serious risk. The Commission has also issued 28 press releases disseminating the serious situation of human rights in Nicaragua. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reaffirms the importance of Nicaragua finding a democratic solution to the crisis, as well as its commitment to continue monitoring the situation in order to ensure the protection of life and physical integrity of the people, defend the victims, and the freedom of expression of the Nicaraguan people. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman McGovern. On behalf of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, I would like to thank you for the invitation extended to us to brief the Commission about the findings from our monitoring activities since April 2018 and recommendations made by the High Commissioner of Human Rights to the states of Nicaragua and the international community. My attendance today is in my capacity as Senior Human Rights Officer of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mission Coordinator for Nicaragua. I'm here to provide an informal and sworn oral briefing to the Commission on the topic of human rights crisis in Nicaragua, and nothing in my remarks should be understood to be a waiver, express or imply, of the privilege and immunity of the United Nations under the 1946 Convention. I would like to start briefly referring to the OHCHR mandates and to focus my intervention on our work in Nicaragua. Our office is the leading UN entity on human rights who has a unique mandate to promote and protect all the human rights for all people. Within the framework of its global mandate under the General Assembly Resolution 48/141, our office provides assistance in the form of technical expertise and capacity development in order to support the implementation of international human rights norms and standards on the ground. Monitoring and reporting is a fundamental part of our work. Through the independent voice of the High Commissioner, the office can identify gaps concerning fulfillment and implementation of human rights and play an important role in raising the alarm on a specific situation with an aim at preventing human rights violations. Our report on Nicaragua and the recommendation provided therein offer, we believe, an important tool to help Nicaragua overcome its current deep political and social crisis, strengthen its institutions, and help in the search for truth and accountability. I'm very happy to have here working with Maria Claudia, because this is the way we are working in the field. At the invitation of the government, a team of our office was deployed in Nicaragua on 26 June of this year to support the work of the Verification and Security Commission established within the national dialogue process and to carry out human rights monitoring. On 29 August, the then High Commissioner Said Raad Hussein presented the public report Human Rights Violations and Abuses in the Context of Protest in Nicaragua, 18 April, 18 August 2018. As highlighted and mentioned here by the former High Commissioner, repression and violence observed over the past 5 months are the product of the systematic erosion of human rights over the years, and highlight the overall fragility of institutions of the rule of law. Based on analysis of information available for office, the overall response of authority to protest has failed to meet applicable standards of the management of assemblies in violation of international human rights law. Human rights violations documented by the office include disproportionate use of force by the police that sometimes result in extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, obstruction to access to medical care, widespread arbitrary or illegal detention, prevalent ill treatment and instances of torture and sexual violence in detention centers, violation of freedom of peaceful assembly and expression, including the criminalization of social leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, and professors considered critical of the government. In the current stage of the crisis, authorities continue to resort to smear campaigns, threats of prosecutions, arbitrary dismissal of civil servants, and other forms of harassment or intimidation against individuals and human rights defenders perceived as critical of the government. Leaders of rural movements, Movimiento Campesino, and of students' movements have been particularly targeted. This pattern has created a climate of fear and mistrust amongst the population. The level of persecution is such that many of those who have participated in the protest, defended the rights of the protesters, or simply expressed dissenting opinion have been forced to hide, have left Nicaragua, or are trying to do so. The current number of protests reduced indicates the chilling effect of the repression. Regarding state's duty to investigate, rather than recognizing responsibility for any wrongdoing during the crisis, the government has placed the blame on social and opposition leaders, human rights defenders, and the media outlets for what they have termed coup-related violence. In the report, the High Commissioner made 16 recommendations, 12 to the government, 2 to the National Human Rights Institution, and 2 to the international community. Among them, put an immediate end to harassment, intimidation, stigmatization, criminalization, and other types of reprisals in relation to participation in the protest. Ensure that independent, impartial, effective, and transparent investigations be promptly conducted into all allegations of serious human rights violations and abuses that have occurred since 18 April. All unlawful arrests and release all persons who have been arbitrarily detained. Ensure that the due process rights of all persons being prosecuted are respected, and that any criminal charges brought against them are in line with the principles of legality, proportionality, and individual liability. Resume the national dialogue in a meaningful and inclusive way to reach agreement based on human rights and democratic principles. Grant our office direct and unfettered access to the whole country, including places in detention. ensure effective cooperation with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Special Monitoring Mechanism for Nicaragua and the Interdisciplinary Group on Independent Experts. And regarding the Human Rights Council and the broader international community, I will finish with this, monitor the developments in Nicaragua, consider taking measures to prevent a further deterioration of human rights situation, and encourage the General Assembly to do the same. Such measures could include the creation of an international commission of inquiry or a hybrid national-international true commission to ensure access to truth, justice, and reparation for victims, and call Nicaragua to abide by its international human rights obligations and to fulfill its voluntary commitments and pledges, including in the context of the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism of the Human Rights Council, and to fully cooperate with human rights bodies and mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Polito, you mentioned the installation of the special monitoring mechanism for Nicaragua in June, and the creation of the interdisciplinary group of independent experts on July 3rd. Can you explain for us the mandates of these two bodies and how they relate, and if you could update us as to the status of these two bodies? I mean, do they continue to function in Nicaragua? Just press your mic, yeah.
The MECENI, the special mechanism for the following up in Nicaragua, has two mandates, principal mandates. On one side, the MECENI has to follow up the compliance of the 15 recommendations issued by the Commission. And at the beginning, we have the opportunity to have a high-level dialogue with the authorities in Nicaragua in exchanging information regarding the advance and challenges to fulfill those recommendations. And it was important. We have the opportunity to meet with them in a collective manner, and also to have bilateral meetings. But then, as I said, since the beginning of July, those interchange of information stopped. And the other mandate that has the MECENI is to monitoring the situation in the field, what is happening, and how it do that. It can have meetings with NGOs, with victims, families, relatives of the victims, and also now we are working really focused on capacity building of the civil society, how the civil society can use the Inter-American Commission's mechanism in order to promote the human rights and defend the human rights of the people in Nicaragua. And on the other side, the group of independent experts have a very particular mandate to help to help the internal, the national authorities for the prosecutions of the crimes committed since August 18 to May 30th. So it has like a special time for its mandate. The situation now is that they never have access to the files in order to review the files and to cooperate directly with the authorities. And then it's really important to share with you that in the agreement that the Commission signed with the state and the General Secretariat was a provision that the state had to provide all the facilities for this group to access to the files and to the witness and to the hearings, but it never happened. So the group is working in the field with experts, but with other means in order to collect data and evidence, with the idea to draft and to present a report at the end of its mandate December of this year.
But essentially, because of the lack of cooperation by the authorities, the mandates are severely diminished. I mean, you can monitor in the field, but that's about it, right?
Yes, and you can't. One of the main concerns that we have is regarding the protection of the people that the Commission issued precautionary measures.
Right.
We have 114 people beneficiary of those measures, but we don't know how the states are providing that protection. And actually, in the last time that we were with Guillermo, that we met with Guillermo in Managua, we discussed with the people directly how are these precautionary measures being enforced, and they said that there is nothing from the state at that level.
So both your organizations have, along with many others, have called for accountability for human rights abuses that have taken place. And in order to do that, you need to have access to files, and the documentation has to be there. There has to be preservation of evidence, and that might be used for future prosecutions. But you can't do that without the cooperation of the authorities. I'm just trying to figure out, like, what options do you have to encourage the government to grant you access to the people that you want to talk to, or to the files that you need? Where is our ability to get them to cooperate? What can we do better to get them to be more cooperative?
We think the Commission has been discussing a lot about this issue, and we start looking for different channels. The first one was the diplomatic channel, and the Commission tried to retake the dialogue with the state, but with any success. So we think that the multilateral approach, it is really important, and in the case of the Organization of American States, the active role in the Permanent Council, trying to create and we can see the environment that can't lead that the government change their willingness, that we know that if the government just want to open the files, they can do it if they want, because they did it in the past. So we thought that the role of the international community is crucial at this point, because Nicaragua is also reaching the different states and international bodies for cooperation. So we think that the international community has a really important role to let the state to change its ways that they have now.
Yeah. Only to complement that, first, I think there are different approaches. Regarding human rights violations, I think we have the information. That's why we had reports saying that happened. Another track is regarding individual responsibility. There's criminal investigation. That's a problem right now, because basically you don't have any kind of respect of due process guarantees. And I think, according to what's saying here, in different levels, there's a set of recommendations. But the main thing is political will for the implementation. But we discuss a lot. We send a lot of recommendations, and apparently, regarding the different phases, they are more or less willing. But only to finish, for us, there are two key approaches. One is victims, rights of victims, and the second one is how to get back to dialogue, create the conditions to get back to the dialogue.
Well, maybe we can talk about that for a minute. What conditions would it require to accomplish a peaceful, negotiated solution to the current conflict? And again, we're trying to figure out where the levers are. I mean, how much leverage do you think the UN and the OAS mechanisms will have to push for democratic reforms and to help push the government toward, a peaceful solution to what's happening now? Because I mean, you know, as I'm looking at this from here, it seems the situation continues to get worse. And the government seems to get more and more intransigent. I'm just trying to figure out how do we create these conditions, and what are those conditions, so that we can, you know, end the violence and, you know, and get a peaceful, negotiated solution to the political crisis.
This is a really difficult question because from our perspective, that is the human rights, verification and monitoring in the country. I think that there is another level, it's a level of a political discussion, and the Commission has been really cautious to be a part of that political discussion, and more than to provide information and evidence of what is happening in Nicaragua right now. But certainly the Commission thinks that the role of the, in the case of the regional level, the role working together, the General Secretariat of the OAS, the political bodies of the organization, and particularly the role of the countries that are part of the organizations are crucial to set the conditions that needed in order to reassume the national dialogue and to legitimize the participation of the different actors that were in the table.
More or less in the same sense. In fact, the regional universal entities are working in this regard. We are working on the field of human rights, but in both cases, the political entities are working, and for sure in OIS, and they have resolutions, recommendations, but also Political Affairs Department of the UN. We are in contact from Nicaragua, but they are in charge, and the Secretary General has already meetings and recommendations in this regard. But our work regarding monitoring and recommendations are basically on the field of human rights.
Mr. Maldonado, you mentioned a joint mission with UNESCO to monitor the situation of journalists and media workers. Can you evaluate for us the situation of journalists and media at this point in time in Nicaragua?
Well, during the period we were there, you really find part of what the government, we mentioned this in the report, feel that is in opposition or critical as part of the victims of different kind of harassment and attacks. And that's happened in many ways. In fact, part of the victims were journalists. There are some kind of harassments against some of the networks, including regarding TV or people that they're part of the demonstration for communication means. And the last information that we have receiving is including some basic needs regarding the elements that they have to import for other countries, because the lack of funds that they are saying no, or saying one of the main newspapers that they mention us, and we mentioned in the report that they should start to work only in black and white, because they will not receive different in this regard. But for sure, on the other hand, you have access to different newspapers or on TV and radio of the opposition, but in this complex framework.
So the government of Nicaragua has said that some of the violence has been done. I mean, obviously they try to blame the opposition, but then they say some of the violence against the opposition have been done by forces that are not connected to the government. You know, that the government hasn't done anything. And we know that's not the case, but do we know, what do we know about the origins and compositions of these pro-government armed groups that are doing some of the dirty work for the government?
From the testimonies that we receive and the different investigations that we conduct, we have now a better sense of how the structure is in the different forces. We have a police force that it has a mandate over every single aspect of the civil civil security enforcement. But then they have like a group of people who work really close to the police agents, and we call them as a para-police groups, because they are following the instructions of the police. They are on charge of the repression, detention of people, and they conduct all the people that they detain to the centrals of the police forces, and they work really close. And we know now, the government says that it's like a voluntary police force, but it's an irregular force. It's not subject to any law or protocol, and it seems to have really close ties with the official party. So, and there is a lot of another group of people which they call turbas. There is people, normal people, ordinary people, who just are paid to be a part of the repression of demonstrations, or to be in the political rails that the party conduct. So there are like the official, unofficial, but structure are this third group of turbas.
Yeah, I'm trying to be sensitive to not ask you political questions, but maybe we can kind of close this panel with maybe some description and your concerns about the recent anti-terrorism laws that have been put into place, and how they're affecting the human rights situation.
The recent anti-terrorism legislation and its
The anti-terrorism legislation that has been proposed?
your concern, if you could elaborate on the concerns.
The information that we have now is that this is a very broad terrorism law, and it could be used for any conduct, just to be opposing the regime, participating in any kinds of demonstrations, or the things that the state assume as a threat. Mm-hmm. But we have recent information that the one organization, the Senate, is presented appeal against the law. So we are waiting. It's difficult to have any success with this close and one head state, but we are following up really close too.
The High Commissioner Office issued some kind of statement regarding the proposal to reform the terrorism law, and we receive a very strong response for the government. And
I assume not happy with your response, right?
Absolutely.
Right, okay, yeah.
We released that statement because the experience in the region was that this kind of law was used against protests and social indigenous leaders. And so we alerted the risk regarding not only the content, but also when will be discussed. This is the middle of the protest. And we mentioned also in the report, it's not only the content, but also the interpretation
Right.
of the law. And what we found is that that was incredible open.
Right.
Basically, probably 80–90% of the cases that people that were participating in the protest were accused of terrorism and be part of a criminal
Right.
gang, basically.
And we've done many hearings on the human rights records by authoritarian regimes all around the world, and the experience is that they pass these anti-terrorism laws to put a legal justification on cracking down on their opponents, who are engaged in nothing more than peaceful protests. Let me just finally just say, look, we're trying to figure out how we can be constructive in helping to not only highlight the human rights situation, but also to push for resolution in terms of this conflict. And it's not so apparent how we can be most constructive here in the Congress. So I don't know whether you have any suggestions of things that we might do that might be effective in changing the reality, which again seems to me, as I'm watching things unfold, to be getting worse and not getting better. But I'd let you, or if you have any other final thoughts that you might want to express that I haven't asked, I'll afford you this opportunity to do that.
In our case, we understand that frustrations. We have the opportunity to talk with people in different stages of this crisis. And every time that we have this interview, we can have the sense of how the situation is putting more pressure on the people. So the Commission is trying to understand how, with the limits of its mandates, can work more closely and to be more useful in this situation. The Commission thinks that it's important that the U.S. continue supporting the multilateral mechanisms to protect human rights in Nicaragua. The leadership is really important, and the presence in the field is crucial. But I take the homework to transmit this question to the Commission, who is going to have a session in Boulder, Colorado, the next week. So maybe the 7 members of the Commission can discuss it, and we can present a writing response to this crucial
That would be
questions.
helpful. That would be helpful.
Yes.
More or less in the same sense. We have different functions in the UN, and I know, because we were in touch for the last 3 months at least with the Department of Political Affairs, and they are working very hard in order to how to improve the situation and offer some kind of the services, in coordination also with the regional OIS, or Inter-American Human Rights Commission. Again, I think it's very important in both cases to be in the field, in our cases. Only to including the case when we were staying in Managua, people said that they prefer to stay in Managua, not throughout the country, because they feel a better protection in that case. I think, again, how to come back to the dialogue. It's interdisciplinary action. Part will be human rights, the other will be the other agents.
Mm-hmm.
But will be key to find what are the conditions that are acceptable for all parts. And again, what's mentioned during the discussion also and the report, not only what will happen in the next months, but in the next years. And that will be absolutely key. And again, this is we raised this in the presentation of the report. It's not only about the crisis. There are some kind of measures to face the crisis, but this is, as mentioned the High Commissioner, a long-term problem, related to rule of law and democratic institutions.
No, and I appreciate that, and I know it's a difficult question to ask, but I ask it because, you know, I want to make sure that what we do here doesn't further polarize the situation. And I'm just going to say in all candor, I mean, when we talk about human rights, our current administration doesn't always walk the walk when it comes to human rights, and so sometimes, depending on who's delivering the message, makes a difference. And I don't want you to comment on that, but I'm just saying for the record that you know, I think what we're focused on is making sure that you know, the human rights violations stop and the people of Nicaragua get to determine their own fate without interference from outside sources, and to be able to do so in a peaceful way, and to be able to do so like any one of us, all of us in this room would like to do in terms of our respective governments. But I would just close by saying that if you have ideas of ways that members of Congress in particular can be of help, whether it's through doing a visit, or going to, you know, or talking directly to the Nicaraguan government, or what have you, I mean, we are certainly open to that. That's what part of this commission's mission is to try to figure out how we can help move things in a positive direction. But we have been getting calls from people from all sectors expressing their deep concern over what's happening. We have had members who are Sandinistas. We have had people call us who are Sandinistas. I've had Jesuit priests. I've had teachers. I've had, you know, journalists. You know, I mean, you name the, you know, the background of somebody, and they've called us to express their concern over what's happening. And so we want to try to be of help if we can. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. Yeah. Our next panel is Jorge Enriquez, as a member of the Creole community of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, with years of experience in community development work and support for the rights of indigenous and Afro-descendant people. He's advocated for the autonomy for the Caribbean coast and opposed Law 840, which gave the Chinese investor group, HKND, large concessions to build the Transoceanic Canal. He's one of the founders of the self-convened coastal movement created in the context of the recent protest. And then Julio Martinez Ellsberg lives in Nicaragua, is a member of the Platform for Social Movements and Civil Society Organizations, as well as an advisor to the University Coordinator for Democracy and Justice, one of the main student movements in the National Dialogue. Both organizations have been working since April 18th to bring an end to the politically motivated murders and detentions in Nicaragua and ensure that there is justice for the repression that has occurred and return the country to a democratic path. We appreciate both of you being here, and who wants to begin for it? Mr. Enriquez? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good morning to all. My name is Jorge Enrique Skyan, a Creole Afro-descendant from the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. On behalf of my country, fellow members, and communities, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to all who have contributed to make this opportunity happen. When I got the privilege to address the Congress of the United States of America, my first thought was, how can I express to you the pain that my country is suffering is not the same ever since April 19th. We do not have peace but turmoil because of the irresponsibility of the central government to respect the basic conditions of human rights of our society. The Nicaraguan Constitution recognizes us the right to protest and speak out against a system that is not beneficial for our people, and we decided to exercise this right. I am here to tell you that the situation in Nicaragua is a problem that is taking away the lives of our children and youth. At the same time, it is a problem that is affecting migration to our neighbors in Central America area, which soon will be reflected on the United States border because of the over 23,000 people that had left the country since this turmoil started. So it is important to call your attention and the level and intensity of the atrocities committed by the police and paramilitary forces directed by the president of our country in the past 5 months. While writing these lines, a friend I have in Costa Rica in a refugee camp told me, people are trying to leave Costa Rica and reach to the USA because here there is no work. We got to depend on people to eat. I am young and I can't live too long as a beggar. And I believe the same is happening to other refugees in other countries in Central America. As you may see, those 23,000 people that had emigrated are expecting to go back home to Nicaragua, but if not, their destination would be the USA borders. In Nicaragua, our human rights as indigenous and Afro-descendant people were also being violated even before April 19, 2018. And for this, we ask all people and countries who are in favor of peace, democracy, justice, and respect for basic human rights to take a close look at what is happening in our country at the fear people are in. Today, we need of your influence for Ortega to comply with the respect of basic human rights, which has been taken away from us because of his incapacity to govern and constant violation of our constitution. Nicaraguans today demand changes in a peaceful, non-violent way. Our parents and grandparents already lived two different moments of wars during the 70s and 80s. We believe in a non-violent and non-military revolution is possible for structural changes and fundamental changes in benefit of all Nicaraguans. Ortega's violation of human rights in Nicaragua did not begin in April, and the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, it began way before. Between 2011 and 2018, there are over 3,000 indigenous people displaced, over 100 documented cases of indigenous and Afro-descendant people of the Caribbean coast that had been either kidnapped, injured, or killed because of a policy of colonization of the Ortega's government supporting land grabbers to establish themselves on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua in exchange for electoral votes. 12 communities on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, Francia Sirpe, Santa Clara, La Esperanza, Rio Guagua, Wisconsin, San Jerónimo, Santa Fe, Esperanza, Rio Coco, Clisnac, Polo Paiwas, Cocal, Naranjal, Wikinac, had been benefited with precautionary protection measures by the International Court of Human Rights. These are not being respected or supported by Ortega's regime, and they are still suffering constant attacks from a program of colonization supported by Ortega's government. The actual repression that protesters are facing since April 2018 in different departments in Nicaragua is not new for some people on the Caribbean coast. They perfected this type of repression on the Caribbean coast, but when it was spoken about, very few people decided to listen or help us to speak out about it. And many accuse us as racist, radicals, separatists, and others. The rapporteur for indigenous human rights called on the Nicaraguan authorities to immediately establish a dialogue with the indigenous communities in order to agree on a long-term solution to the situation and to initiate the sanitation process to which they committed to do, prioritizing these territories in conflict, to proceed to the transfer of the settlers to their places of origin or to their location. However, the authorities ignored the calls making justice for people on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and access to land rights a difficult issue. Ortega government is always in a constant negation of incidents, the same way he is in denial of the deaths, tortured, injured, and disappeared people since April 2018. But I must speak also for the mestizos campesinos, who led the nation in the first widespread protest against the regime and suffered unnumbered repression from the Ortega's regime. This began in 2013 when a so-called Great Interoceanic Canal Law was approved in a matter of hours by the Ortega's controlled National Assembly, a coast-to-coast project in which a chunk of Nicaragua was literally handed to a Hong Kong financial tycoon in return for a now legally binding concession that would physically alter the geography and ethnography of the country and whole Central America. There was no consultation with the indigenous, Afro-descendant, campesinos, civil society, or any sector in Nicaragua, notwithstanding the consultation requirements upheld in the Constitution, the Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, the Autonomy Law of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and the Law of Demarcation and Land Titling of indigenous and Afro-descendant people of Nicaragua, basing on customary rights. We see that the use of thugs and paramilitary repression that protesters faced in Nicaragua since April 2018 were tried out and perfected years earlier on the Caribbean coast and rural Nicaragua. 98 marches were held by campesinos and environmental groups accompanied by different sectors of Nicaragua in protest of this canal project. Often, they were met with brutal, violent forces from the government, thugs, and police, provoking a number of injuries as a clear statement that in the country there is no freedom of speech and mobilization. But the campesinos kept on marching through violent repression, lifting up the morale of our people throughout a civil and non-violent protest as they marched in the major cities peacefully and non-violently. If we protested, we were accused of being racist, radicals, separatists, and now because of recently enacted security law, protesters are now called terrorists subject to 20-year sentence for protesting. These people Ortega is calling terrorists had never left the country. Most of these people don't own a passport or have a Wi-Fi access at home. The key campesinos leaders, 3 of them, Medardo Mairena, Pedro Mena, and Victor Diaz, is in jail charged with homicide, and other leaders such as Francisca Ramirez, known as Doña Chica, was forced to flee to Costa Rica as a clear way of persecution of leaders in the country. This commission, Mr. Chairman, should speak out and support us on the behalf of those mentioned today. Now a question is in matter. Why have all these international treaties of protection for human rights and minority rights for people if they are not being respected? Our struggle for our people on the Caribbean coast has historically been directed at the Nicaraguan state. But today, we join everyone in the country against Ortega and his wife regime. Today, people of Nicaragua from all different scopes of life are united asking for basic human rights respects such as the right to live, freedom of speech, access to justice, liberty, freedom of mobilization and organization. We are demanding the resignation of the President and Vice President Ortega and his wife due to basic human rights violation. In the United States, at least 2 presidents barely escaped impeachment for acts that were far less serious than those committed by Ortega. I ask all of you, how can one ethically demand anything less than the resignation of a sitting commander-in-chief that give orders to shoot, to kill his own people? Our protests in April were not party politically led. These protests were led by grassroots organizations, feminist organizations, LGBT collectiveness, civil society, and students, based on 11 years of constitutional and human rights violation. Our protests are civic and nonviolent. 18 kids under the age of 18 had been shot dead by paramilitaries, including a 2-year-old baby, and an entire family burned up in their houses because they denied paramilitary to enter their house to shoot at protesters. A journalist from Bluefields, Angel Gaona, shot in his head and killed while transmitting live, and 2 Creole boys, Glenn Slate and Brandon Lovo, 20 and 18 years old, wrongfully accused of Angel's death. 25 deaths in protest in Carazo, and at least 18 deaths on Mother's Day protest. Nicaragua had in the last 40 years 2 armed revolutions. The revolution to overthrow Somozas in the 70s and the Contra-Revolution which overthrew the Sandinistas in the late 80s. Both revolutions left the country a death toll of over 50,000 deaths, experience which is not desired by my generation. The Nicaragua protest is not a fight about lefties against righties or righties against lefties. This is a fight for survival and respect of basic human rights for women, children, indigenous, Afro-descendant, campesino, students, and everyone. This is the fight of Nicaragua people against Ortega and his wife regime, who is persecuting all upcoming leadership and all leadership, including the Frente Sandinista revolutionary leaders. The regime criminalized protesters as terrorists, torturing and depriving of basic human rights of people who are being locked up in El Chipote. Today, we ask you to request and to the Nicaraguan government the close of El Chipote jailhouse, where there is infrahuman conditions for prisoners and no political prisoners. All genocides and war conflicts in human history, I'm going to repeat this, all genocides and war conflicts in human history are started with basic human rights violation. War is not an option for us. No one wins with a war. Our economy and country are too poor and fragile, and we had learned that there is no winner in a war. Our fight is going to continue being a non-violent fight. Avoiding a genocide in Nicaragua may be in the hands and effectiveness of complying the respect of international human rights. I am closing this statement with a Martin Luther King Jr. statement that says, "Justice too long denied is a threat to justice anywhere." Thank you very much. Thank you, Pali.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Ellsberg?
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Julio Martinez Ellsberg. I am part of the Articulación de Movimientos Sociales y Organizaciones de Sociedad Civil, platform for social movements in Nicaragua. First of all, we are grateful to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and it's taking a sincere interest in the current plight of the Nicaraguan people. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who along with the Nicaraguan and international human rights groups have provided accurate depictions of the reality that the Nicaraguan government stubbornly refuses to acknowledge. They have been exemplary in their roles as witnesses and defenders and deserve the recognition of us all. I would like to start my testimony by mentioning the names of Yaritza Rostran, Victoria Obando, Levi Rugama, Jonathan Lopez, Amaya Coppens, Nairobi Olivas, Luis Quiroz, Byron Correa. These are students within the Nicaraguan public university system who have been bravely organizing students in their faculties and in other universities to demand freedom of expression, freedom from violence for the Nicaraguan state, and university autonomy. These students, most of whom I have known and worked with since the beginning of the protests, were arrested and taken to the El Chipote prison, the same place where the Somoza dictatorship used to hold and torture its political prisoners. So were some of their professors, such as Ricardo Altodano of the UOPOLI, as well as over 300 fellow citizens who have been part of the protests. I will mention that this is no abstract matter for me personally. I became involved during the first days of the protest when I saw students and my friends that were part of the protest were being brutally attacked by government groups and later police and paramilitaries. Like thousands of Nicaraguans, I decided to find a way to help in any way that I could, participating in marches and later helping organize. This led me to experience attack by paramilitaries and witness horrible situations, such as when I took a teenager who had been wounded by gunshot from one hospital to another in my sedan because his family was terrified of keeping him in the public health system, as the entire public health system has been complicit with the repression, either denying care to protesters, handing over wounded people to the police, to denying mothers the bodies of their children until they signed documents saying that they had not died in anything related to the protests. The current state of affairs in my country is the following. After the massacre of hundreds of my fellow Nicaraguans, Ortega lost the support of all sectors, the church, the traditional Sandinista communities, and most of the big business on which he has relied upon for support over the last decade. For fear of losing it all, he is now moving on to intimidating the population by kidnapping all organizers nationwide. We face jail, exile, or death. And we speak here today not knowing if we will be arrested upon arrival in Nicaragua. He hopes that by intimidating the Nicaraguan people, he discourages them from protesting, and if there are no more people in the streets, that the economy can go back to the so-called normal, and that he can go back to business as usual with the financial oligarchy of Nicaragua and American businesses, as though nothing had happened. However, that former state of affairs will not return. The level of violence and murder and the political and economic crisis that it has created is one that Ortega cannot himself undo, and that the Nicaraguan people are not going to just forget. Even in the midst of this murder and intimidation, the Nicaraguan people have not stopped protesting peacefully a single week in 5 months. And they will not stop until real change is achieved. The platform of social movements, of which I am a part of, and which represents more than 60 grassroots organizations, believe that the following are key demands that must be respected for the country to go back to normality. 1, that the Ortega government must halt the repression of the marches and respect Nicaraguans' right to assemble and protest nonviolently. This entails an end to the shootings, arbitrary arrests, and disappearances. We also consider it important for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to be allowed back into the country and be part of the group that's observing these changes. He must also free immediately more than 300 political prisoners. As human rights groups have already documented, the judicial system no longer is capable of delivering justice to the Nicaraguan people. Meanwhile, the government obviously cannot be trusted to investigate its own crimes. That is why, to move past this as a nation, investigations must be carried out by independent groups, ideally by the independent group of international experts that are already in the country, led by Ms. Claudia Paz y Paz, to find those responsible for the murders over the past 5 months, who can then be tried. Paramilitaries must be disbanded. This apparatus that had been created by the government, and which many suspect have ties to the army, work side by side with the police to attack the Nicaraguan population. We as a nation fear they are not disbanded immediately. They will become a new, permanent, destabilizing force, not only for Nicaragua, but for the region as a whole, reinforcing the Mesoamerican gang system. Early elections must happen as soon as possible, after having carried out the necessary electoral reforms so that free elections are truly possible in our country. Through these elections, we want to return a new page in Nicaraguan history, where our government has respect for grassroots movements, local governance, where it has respect for the autonomy of the Caribbean coast, of the universities, of the municipalities, and respect for all Nicaraguans to organize and express themselves freely. Yet, it is important to mention that the reforms necessary to turn Nicaragua into a republic will not be possible in Nicaragua until after Ortega's resignation. Heads of government have resigned for much less, and we deserve the right to demand that our public servants step down after such attacks on the population. We will continue to demand that resignation of the president and vice president and all government officials who have been responsible for the atrocities that have been committed. As social movements, we reiterate that the call has always been for nonviolence. And also, we reiterate that our call is for this to be solved by Nicaraguans. No military intervention from any direction, as we know, is asked for. As we know from recent history, that this would only bring more suffering to our people. Yet, Nicaragua is part of a larger community of nations, and it is important for those in the community to do what they can to help us with the most important human right of all, to stay alive and safe to restore justice to the country. This is why we fully support the resolution that was already put forward by the Organization of American States that, I quote, calls upon member and observer states to implement, in accordance with their respective legal frameworks and applicable international law, appropriate diplomatic measures to assist in the restoration of the rule of law and the protection of human rights in Nicaragua. We too hope that all member observer states to the OES, including this one, will do what is in their power to pressure the Nicaraguan government and help the Nicaraguan people in this time of need. We thank you again for your solidarity and invitation to speak here today. Viva Nicaragua Libre.
Well, thank you both for your testimony and for your courage, and we appreciate very much you providing testimony to the commission. And I think what we're looking for is to figure out specifically how we can be helpful. I mean, if you could give us an assignment, what would the assignment be? I mean, I appreciate that all members of the OAS take appropriate measures to demand that rule of law be respected and that human rights be respected and that democracy prevails, but that's kind of vague. And so what is an appropriate measure? What should members of Congress do? What should we be? I mean, other than speaking out against the terrible situation in Nicaragua, we've issued statements about the repression and the crackdown on protests, and we've met with I met with the Nicaraguan ambassador and other government officials who have come up here and expressed my concern. But I think we're at a different point now where that's not enough. And so specifically, if you were our teachers and giving us assignments, what would the assignments be?
I think the one thing that we have to point out is that Daniel Ortega is one of the largest capitalists in our country. He depends fully on positive relations with the United States and the United States private sector. We think that all signs that help create that, and he's hoping that he will get the green light from this direction for things to continue going normally. He can't do it without support from here. All signs that that green light will not be given to him are extremely welcome. And that is from the American private sector as well as from American politicians. From our side, we know that you are considering, for instance, individualized sanctions.
Right. Under the Magnitsky Act, right? Yeah.
We think that that is most definitely appropriate. They have, after hurting so many people, this would hurt them, and we think that that's appropriate. We think that I'll stop there for now.
Yes, I love the question you asked. One, we need you all to apply strong economical sanctions on Ortega and his cupola and the military and the paramilitary. I mean, having tax collectors pay and having United States investment in Nicaragua, doing business with someone that is openly violating human rights doesn't work. I mean, economical sanctions need to be applied to Ortega, to his family, and to everyone that works with him. And sanctions should not only apply to high ranks individuals, because when they apply to the high ranks individuals, the one that follows him gets promoted. Then you sanction that other one, and the one that follows him or her also get promoted. So they're like, okay, sanction 1, sanction 2, sanction 3, I'm going to always be promoting someone. So we need collective sanctioning of those high officers and those that come after him. So that's what we need. We need strong economical sanction on Ortega's, and also on the military. Also on the military, because having armed ISIS-looking caravans of group parading in your country and your military doesn't intervene to stop this means that they're accomplices of what is taking place. And we know that the military have shares here in the United States, and have investment here in the United States. The military is one of the biggest capitalist investors of Nicaragua, and they have investment all over the United States. So I would start with strong economical sanction to the military, to Ortega's regime, to his family, and to all those people that are supporting him.
So let me ask you, if the president and the vice president agreed to step down before the next elections, which right now are due in November 2021, under the Constitution, who takes their places? How does that work?
Head of Parliament.
And tell me about the head of Parliament.
It's all part of one same system.
Right.
This is a one-party state,
So
and everything is run by Daniel Ortega. Nobody else makes any decision outside of the presidential office. So to think that there is some sort of independent legislature that
Right.
that can take care of that's unrealistic. So it really, that is why we have been pushing for there to be a caretaker government. This means people that represent different sectors of Nicaraguan society that can oversee the electoral reforms. Let's see, if he steps down, there can be a committee of made up people from the private sector, from the social movements, from different sectors, people that are respected by Nicaraguans. Then there is so much leadership in Nicaragua who have been pushing this broad-based movement that there are plenty of people that can be part of a caretaker government and oversee the reforms so the elections can take place within 6 to 9 months. We don't see that at all as a power vacuum. There's definitely enough people with experience and capacity inside of Nicaragua to carry this forward.
now the Nicaraguan government told us when they met with us that when we urged them to have earlier elections, said that the conditions in Nicaragua are too polarized and too chaotic to be able to have free and fair elections. I mean, you obviously dispute that, right? I mean, you think that if elections were moved up to 9 months from now or whatever the date is, that the conditions are such that people would feel safe enough to go out and vote, and you'd be able to have a fair election?
Under the actual conditions, the political system in Nicaragua is politicized in favor of the Frente Sandinista. So if Ortega and his wife leave power without structural changes in our electoral system and our constitution, we're going to make another Daniel Ortega in the country. So the idea is to have a transitional government that will accompany structural electoral changes with international accompaniment, for then in 6 to 9 months go to another election. So if Ortega and his wife leaves right now, and we go to an election without structural changes in our electoral law and our constitution, what we are going to end up doing is giving Ortega and his family another country and more power. So that's what we need. A transitional government with international accompaniment that can help us make structural changes in the electoral system and in the constitution.
I would also challenge the idea, again, of this polarization and reasons for which there can't be elections. There was polarization before. There might have been challenges between people, say, from the church and the feminist movements, or from the anti-canal movement in the private sector, and from many other groups among each other. But all of this is one solid block right now in the social movements. And pretty much the only people that come out to march against are people that are paid by the Ortega government. The platform that we are part of meets regularly with the Civic Alliance. And in general, the opposition is moving in the same direction, and all these different sectors will support each other. The only thing that's kind of preventing there from being an actual real, say, possibilities for which there can't be elections tomorrow is that the Sandinista party has been blocking the participation of many political parties, as well as people running at the local level and running for local elections, for anything else. So it is once those reforms can take place, so that people can start running at the local level, at the parliamentary level, that you can have perfectly good elections once you have the reforms to the Constitution.
And I just want, just going back to the issue that one of your suggestions before about sanctions. You're talking about targeted sanctions, or are you talking about, more general sanctions? Because I'm just trying to figure out, if we're withholding bilateral, multilateral funding, what would that effect be on the average Nicaraguan? I mean, especially those living at or below the poverty line. How might we, as we figure out how to put pressure on the government, how do we do so in a way that protects Nicaragua's poorest citizens from the economic slowdown that already is occurring?
I believe that it cannot get worse than what we are. I believe people in Nicaragua are willing to make the sacrifice to make ends meet than to be forcing or facing the sacrifice of trying to be killed by a bullet or by paramilitaries or seek refugee in another country. And we also believe that once a democratic country is established or a system established in Nicaragua, our economy will be blossom again.
And you mentioned the opposition. I think Mr. Enrique, in your statement about that it's not left or right, or it's a lot of different people. Maybe you can describe for the record a little bit about who the opposition is, and which leads me to a question about if you could have elections. Given the wide diversity of the opposition, who have different agendas and different points of view and different opinions on a variety of things, do you think that the opposition could have viable candidates if an early election were to be held? As president and as a leader in Congress, Ortega has deliberately weakened the opposition. How likely is he to allow the opposition to organize? Well, I guess if he remains in office until the next election.
We do not have a lack of leadership. There's enough leadership, new leadership in Nicaragua. Imagine what we had achieved, the unity we had achieved in the country in the last 4 or 5 months with a repressive system. Now picture us participating in an election where there's no repression. What we had achieved in the unity we had achieved in the last 4 or 5 months on a repressive system without the possibility of meeting publicly or privately. Now picture us meeting, organizing underneath in a peaceful country. So that wouldn't be a problem. And the creation of a new force, a political force, it also wouldn't be a problem. But right now what we are based on is on the basic respect of our human rights. When that is established and we are in a peaceful situation, the conditions will be set to have a genuine political opposition within the country. But the actual political parties that are in the country are the ones responsible with Daniel Ortega for him to have all this power, he and his wife to have all this power right now.
About this broad-based, yes, it is. Yes, many people have different platforms, but as we've mentioned, this includes from former Sandinista commanders to people from strictly in the private sector who were never part of the movement, to young people who don't consider themselves right or left. It really, and all of the social grassroots movements. There is no division there. But this revolution, do consider it a revolution because of the changes that have to be made at the institutional level and at the entire foundation of the political system in Nicaragua, is strictly anti-dictatorial. And that's what we all agree on. Mm-hmm. We agree on that there can't be a dictatorship in Nicaragua. There has to be plurality in politics for us to actually start thinking about political platforms. And it's once we have those reforms that we can have parties that can consider themselves more right or left. But for the moment, everyone is part of the same block, and expecting that we can create those changes.
Yeah, just finally, I mean, so as you pursue this peaceful transition, there's some issues right here and now in the immediate, which is all these political prisoners, people being harassed, human rights defenders being harassed. Are there things that we can do here in Congress, to put additional pressures on the government in the short term to release the political prisoners, to stop harassing opposition leaders, can we provide better protection to human rights defenders who are courageously speaking up against the repression? I mean, are there things that you think members of Congress can do specifically? Letters, visits. I'm just trying to think about those who right now are in jail who shouldn't be in jail.
Having a high-rank official of the Congress visit Ortega and tell him, look, man, you have to stop these things, then, would really make a big difference. Having someone from here to go physically sit down with him and talk to him and tell him, Ortega, you need to stop this and you need to go. Stop the repression, free our people. That would make a big change, because most of the declarations have been done by letters, by emails, by public. But having someone there, having a Congress or a senator or some high-rank official in Nicaragua talking to him, telling him that what he's done, he need to stop it because the world is watching him and he's already condemned, would really make a big difference.
Then Ortega really cares about what is about pressure from the United States. I mean, as George has mentioned several times before, I mean, he's not particularly afraid necessarily of Costa Rica or of Panama necessarily. He really cares what is being said of him and the pressure that he receives from the United States. And while that is true, our friends could be being tortured right now. People can be killed. People are living in exile. People are living in fear. And this is an entire 5 months. And we do appreciate solidarity, whether it's from the United States Congress and congressmen who do want to go down and put pressure directly. I think that's absolutely something that could help, as well as the connections with all other international actors, such as European Union, and continue to push through the pressure from the multilateral organizations, which we also think is essential. The OAS has done a good job, and we also expect that the UN can continue pressuring. But yes, that will help, and it will save lives and help our people.
Well, I appreciate you being here to testify, and I can assure you that there will be follow-up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Pues a tiempo, porque un día más y posiblemente me hubiesen agarrado, pero algo muy bueno. Sí.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Giancarlo, ¿verdad?
Sí, Giancarlo.
Mucho gusto, Tomás Rodríguez.
Okay. Estuvo buena la presentación.
Me alegro que estés aquí.
Qué bueno, gracias. Sí, vamos, porque la cuestión de la represión al seguimiento de los estudiantes ahorita está muy fuerte y pues con lo último que pasó, que ya habían puesto orden judicial para captura y allanamiento en el lugar que ustedes.
¿Te vas a quedar aquí?
Tengo una serie de reuniones en la agenda y según cómo vea cómo está pasando la protesta en Nicaragua, voy a